Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 41 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. If you're new here, I try my best to create each episode in this series in such a way that it will stand on its own to the extent possible, so that you don't have to go back and listen to all the previous episodes in the series in order to get something out of this one. That said, it is part of a series, and any missing context can usually be found in the previous episodes. For those of you who are regular listeners, I know, the episode is late. It's my constant struggle to balance getting these episodes out to you on time, while still researching the topics thoroughly enough that I'm delivering the solid, nuanced, and fact-based product you deserve. The topic I'm going to cover today is, frankly, one that I did not know too much about before I started preparing this episode, and as a result, I needed a little extra time to do enough research to put this one together. Thanks for waiting. Last time on the History Sphere, I talked about the 1989 Velvet Revolution that toppled the communist regime in Czechoslovakia. This time, I will cover one of the most dramatic and fascinating historical events you have probably never heard of. The Romanian Revolution of December 1989. This is The End of History, Part 41. Media defines civilization. The forms of media that prevail in a given time and in a given society often frame that society's values and its identity. Individuals in that society learn to define themselves through the means of communication that are prevalent in that society. The same media can, of course, be used by different societies or different individuals in the same society for very different purposes. For example, the invention of the printing press revolutionized communication in Europe by allowing people to mass produce and mass distribute ideas. The spread of these ideas gave birth to the Enlightenment, and it shaped the governments and societies of the time. It was not just the ideas of liberalism or natural rights that spread during the Enlightenment. The same intellectual revolution enabled by the printing press also perfected modern ideas of autocracy and enlightened despotism, embraced by many of the rulers at the time. Radio was the medium used by the Axis and Allies alike to spread their ideologies before and during the Second World War. I find it unlikely that fascism, or indeed democracy or communism, could have existed as we know them in the 20th century without the medium of radio to spread, refine, and popularize those ideas. I'm a millennial, the first generation to widely use social media. That form of communication now dominates the modern discourse, and was effectively used by Barack Obama and Donald Trump in their respective runs for the White House. Even podcasts. It seems like everybody listens to podcasts these days. A lot of podcasts, unfortunately, peddle misinformation or disinformation that spreads hatred and puts an even deeper wedge in modern society. In this podcast, I try to do the opposite. I do my best to present nuanced views and spread knowledge and understanding. But regardless of how the medium is used and by whom, it is fundamental in shaping the ideas at the center of our society today. In 1989, the medium that more than any other shaped the ideas and controversies of the time was television. In Romania, television was used by the communist regime to cultivate a peculiar cult of personality around its leader, Nicolae Ceausescu, and would also ultimately be the medium by which the provisional government that replaced and destroyed him would define themselves and take power. Romania, at first glance, shared a similar history with its Eastern Bloc neighbors. Like its neighbor Hungary, prior to the Second World War, Romania had been taken over by a fascist government that allied itself with the Nazis and joined in Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. In 1944, facing defeat, Romania's constitutional monarch, King Michael, led a coup to oust the fascists, and Romania switched sides, joining the Allies and fighting alongside the Soviets to push the Germans out of their country. After the war, Romania fell behind the Iron Curtain. Occupied by the Soviets, King Michael was forced to preside as a figurehead over a government dominated by communists. Finally, in December 1947, Michael was forced to abdicate the throne, and Romania was, like every other Eastern Bloc state at the time, reorganized as a socialist republic, created in the image of Stalin. Nicolae Ceausescu first rose to power in 1965 when, following the death of the previous general secretary of the Romanian Communist Party, Gheorghiu-Dej, he successfully exploited the rivalry between older, more experienced members of the Politburo to outmaneuver them and rise to the party's top position. Born in 1918 in a small town in southern Romania, Ceausescu was an OG communist, first joining the outlawed party in 1932 while working as an apprentice shoemaker in the capital city, Bucharest, at the age of 14. His big break came in 1943, when he was imprisoned by Romania's fascist regime for the third time and shared a cell with Gheorghiu-Dej, becoming the future dictator's loyal friend and protege. As long as the dictator lived, Ceausescu never betrayed him, playing the role of his loyal henchman and only daring to reach for higher office when his mentor died. When he was elected as general secretary, Ceausescu took the party and Romania in a very different direction. He was at first actually very popular with Romania's common people, riding a wave of de-Stalinization and instituting the sort of reforms that Nikita Khrushchev had introduced in the Soviet Union a decade earlier. He freed some political prisoners, he loosened censorship, and he invested large amounts of money in projects to improve the quality of life in Romania, especially in creating more and better public housing. In 1968, Ceausescu further endeared himself to his people by boldly asserting his country's independence from the Soviet Union. He refused to participate in the 1968 Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia and publicly denounced the invasion as a violation of Czechoslovakia's sovereignty. At the time, it appeared that Romania may well have been on its way to its own version of socialism with a human face. But that's not really what Ceausescu had in mind. As I said before, he was an OG communist, and he had little interest in the kind of liberalizing reforms that Dubček had instituted in Czechoslovakia or that Mikhail Gorbachev would later institute in the Soviet Union. He had no interest in being a Soviet satellite and instead wanted to pursue the communist project in his own way. He seems to have found the model he wished to emulate in 1971 when he traveled to China and North Korea. He was particularly drawn to the hybrid ideology of communism with self-sufficient nationalism that he found in North Korea. He was impressed by the mass rallies and the cult of personality built around Kim Il-sung. Upon his return to Romania, Ceausescu published his July Thesis, which was a new political doctrine that borrowed heavily from Kim Il-sung's work on Juche, emphasizing mass mobilization of the population in support of the party, and of course the party's leader, and national self-determination within the framework of Marxism-Leninism. The works of Kim and Mao were translated into Romanian and became required reading for Romanian students. The legacy of Stalin as well, which had been diminished during the program of de-Stalinization, was re-elevated, and de-Stalinization reframed as the turning point where Soviet socialism went wrong. Romania did, of course, maintain close diplomatic and economic ties to the Soviet Union, which, given its geographical location, was a practical necessity. However, when it came to the budding rivalry between the USSR and China, Romania remained decidedly neutral. Ceausescu worked to eliminate his rivals and concentrate all power in the party around himself, cultivating a cult of personality around himself that was unrivaled in Europe since the death of Stalin. The idea of Romania was inseparable from the Communist Party, and the Communist Party was inseparable from the person of Ceausescu. The Romanian Revolution is probably the only one among the anti-communist revolutions of 1989 that follows the familiar tropes of revolution, mirroring past revolutions like the French Revolution. And if Nicolae Ceausescu was destined to play the role of King Louis, his wife Elena was inevitably cast as Romania's Marie Antoinette. When Ceausescu cultivated Romania's cult of personality, she was elevated and quasi-deified alongside him. State propaganda dubbed her the mother of the nation, and despite having almost no formal education, she was conferred multiple honorary doctorates and placed in charge of Romania's academic and scientific research institutions. Most accounts cast her as arrogant and almost comically out of touch with the struggles and realities of daily life for ordinary people. It's hard to say whether she was really that arrogant and out of touch, or whether her role in the mythology of the revolution as the Romanian Marie Antoinette has caused history to exaggerate these traits. What is not in dispute is that Ceausescu was smitten with his wife, and the couple was genuinely happy together. I guess the family that lords over a neo-Stalinist cult of personality together stays together. I'll be sure to let my own wife know. As Ceausescu tightened his grip on power through the 1970s, Romanian society was considerably more tightly controlled and authoritarian than much of the rest of the Eastern Bloc. For example, the regime so feared the dissemination of dissenting ideas that possession of typewriters was strictly controlled and regulated, requiring state-issued license. Those found in possession of a typewriter without such a license were subject to severe criminal penalties. The arm of state terror was, as in other Eastern Bloc states, the secret police, the Securitate, which was carefully cultivated to be fiercely loyal to the person of the General Secretary. Though less famous than their East German counterparts, the Stasi, Romania's Securitate was every bit as repressive and ruthlessly efficient. People lived in constant fear of the Securitate surveillance, and their hundreds of thousands of informants who blended in with the population all over the country. Murder was a tool that the Securitate used sparingly, but did use to great effect, making public examples of dissidents to keep the majority of the population in line. As elsewhere in the communist world, this repression was tolerable for most people through the 1970s, while there was relative economic prosperity. Romania, like the USSR, possessed great energy wealth in the form of crude oil reserves. This had been key to the country's strategic position in World War II, as the bulk of oil that fueled the German war machine came from the oil fields of Romania. While global oil markets soared, Ceausescu was able to fund his expansive infrastructure projects by exporting oil in exchange for hard foreign currency. When global oil markets crashed in the 1980s, which I discussed back in episode 34 with regard to its economic impact on the Soviet Union, these projects became unsustainable. Rather than slow down his development projects, however, Ceausescu opted to borrow massive amounts of money to continue them undeterred, incurring foreign debt at a rate unrivaled by any other Eastern Bloc state. In 1983, determined to free Romania from the weight of foreign debt, Ceausescu began to institute severe austerity measures. Rather than cut back on his development projects, many of which were impractical and fueled by his own vanity, and that of his wife, more than anything else, the austerity measures were aimed at Romania's vast welfare state. Between 1983 and 1985, the state expenditure on housing declined by 37%, healthcare by 17%, and education by a whopping 53%. Food and energy rationing quickly followed. In 1985, average household energy consumption was only 20% of what it had been in 1979. And in 1989, on the eve of the revolution, rolling blackouts were common, and homes were often left without heat, even amidst sub-zero temperatures in the dead of winter. Long lines for food were common, and food rations were often below subsistence levels, meaning people could only survive by turning to the black market and engaging in illegal activity to feed their families, placing them in danger of arrest by the expansive Securitate. In short, the social contract in Romania, similar to that of the Soviet Union and other socialist states wherein people traded their liberty for a measure of economic security, was breaking down because the state was no longer living up to its end of the bargain. Thus, people were starved not only for economic well-being, but liberty as well. Probably the most important factor in why the Romanian Revolution happened when it did was the external factor. Even as perestroika was instituted in the USSR and similar reforms began to spread across Eastern Europe, Ceausescu stubbornly resisted any reform, ensuring that his regime, by refusing to bend, would eventually break. Despite their strict monopoly on information, the regime could not hide from the people the monumental events that had taken place earlier in the year across the Eastern Bloc. It was no secret that Romania was the final holdout, and that were the regime to falter, the Soviet Union would not come to their rescue. This international situation likely emboldened people to take risks that in earlier times, when the communist world was whole, they might not have. The spark that finally ignited this powder keg came in an unexpected place at an unexpected time, centering around a dissident priest of the minority Hungarian Reformed Church in the western Romanian city of Timișoara, Laszlo Tokes. Tokes had organized a campaign of protest against Ceausescu's system of systematization, which I mentioned in my recent episode on Hungary, wherein villages, many of which were inhabited predominantly by the Hungarian minority, were to be demolished, and the peasants moved into urban-style apartment blocks. This program, never actually implemented, was widely seen as a veiled persecution of Romania's mostly rural Hungarian minority. In response to his activism, the regime retaliated against Tokes by seeking to evict him from his home in Timișoara, which happened to be on the church premises, rather than in a public housing block like the ones where most Romanians lived. The dispute set in motion a months-long legal battle over the government's right to evict a priest from church, rather than state, property. As the legal battle was ongoing, the Securitate launched a campaign of intimidation designed to extra-legally evict Tokes from his home, which ultimately rendered him and his family under effective house arrest. And yet, he was undeterred and stood his ground. When the state cut off food and energy rations, he was supported by donations from the congregants of his church, and stubbornly refused to vacate the apartment. Finally, on December 7th, 1989, the court, which was not part of an independent judiciary but under direct Communist Party control, of course ruled against Tokes and issued a final order of eviction. Tokes had no intention of physically resisting his eviction, but he did call for his congregation to gather outside the church on the morning of December 15th, 1989, when the eviction was to be executed, and hold a vigil in moral support. That morning, about 30 mostly elderly parishioners gathered outside the church to publicly protest Tokes' eviction. The crowd happened to be within view of a popular tram station, and commuters took notice of the demonstration and began to mingle with the protesters, spreading word around the city of the Tokes affair and the public demonstration. Soon others began to join the demonstration, and the size of the crowd ballooned into the hundreds. At first joined by Romanian Protestants such as Pentecostals and Baptists, ordinary citizens, mostly young people with no church affiliation, soon started to turn out as well. By that evening, the crowd was so large that traffic in the area was brought to a complete standstill. When Petru Molt, the communist mayor of Timișoara, came to placate the crowd, they became agitated and started to openly chant anti-regime and anti-communist slogans. The situation became so heated that Tokes had to step in to prevent Molt from being lynched. Molt was forced to agree to stay the eviction and to repair the damage done to Tokes' residence by earlier Securitate attempts to intimidate him. The authorities made some arrests at the fringes of the crowd, but at this point the crowd remained mostly peaceful, and the authorities, without the force necessary to suppress the protest, were mostly conciliatory. The next day, Molt followed through on his promises, coming back to the residence with workmen to repair the damage, as well as a doctor to examine Tokes' pregnant wife. Both Tokes and Molt feared the protests spiraling out of control, and at Molt's urging, Tokes even addressed the crowd, urging them to disperse. But the protest had moved on. It was no longer primarily about the Tokes affair. Rather than disperse, the crowd began to move towards the center of town, becoming more and more riled up and brazen as they moved toward the Communist Party headquarters. Unable to break into the party headquarters, the frustrated crowd fanned out across the city, becoming a riot, ransacking and destroying symbols of the regime and images of Ceausescu wherever they were found. The next day, still failing to realize that he was no longer at the center of the revolt, the authorities arrested and brutally beat Tokes before removing him from the city, believing that by removing him, they would remove the source of discontent and the rioters would go home. Instead of calming the crowd, news of Tokesh's arrest only inflamed them further, and that afternoon, thousands of demonstrators marched once again toward the local party headquarters. This time, they found their way blocked by fire engines and rows of soldiers in riot gear. The soldiers attempted to disperse the crowd by spraying them with fire hoses, but this only made them angrier. The crowd pushed through the barricade and, somewhat ironically, set fire to the fire engines. A small group then broke all the way through and pushed into the party headquarters, where they did severe damage to the first 2 floors of the building before security forces rallied to push them out. In response to the chaos at party headquarters, the army was ordered into the city in force to suppress the riots, including a small column of 3 tanks. A group of about 2,000 rioters armed with rocks and Molotov cocktails managed to surround the column of tanks in a back alley. Overwhelmed, the soldiers manning the tanks were forced to abandon the vehicles and retreat on foot, leaving the rioters in possession of their weapons, including 2 of the 3 tanks. One had been disabled by a Molotov cocktail. That evening, the order came directly from Ceausescu in Bucharest to suppress the revolt with deadly force, to shoot the rioters with live ammunition. Throughout the night, gunshots and explosions could be heard throughout the city, as the riot gradually transformed into a war. The army was eventually able to rally and reassert control over the center of the city, though they never entirely suppressed the revolt. But in the process, they suffered dozens of casualties, and they killed 60 civilians while wounding more than 200. Things quieted down over the next 2 days, on December 18th and 19th, as the army imposed unofficial martial law in Timișoara, patrolling the streets and prohibiting gatherings of more than 2 people in any public place. Nonetheless, discontent continued to spread. The morning of December 19th, workers in most of the major factories in Timișoara, people who were supposedly the Communist Party's traditional base of support, initiated a strike. Workers marched out of their factories toward the city center and were soon joined by the wider public. The army had up to this point remained loyal to the regime and had even opened fire on civilians. But it's important to note that most of the rank-and-file soldiers in the Romanian army at this time were conscripts. The army was not a professional force, and most of the soldiers identified more with the demonstrators than they did with the regime. On December 19, 1989, as the striking factory workers and demonstrators again made their way toward a confrontation with the soldiers assembled to stop them, a now famous scene played out. As the crowd approached, some of the soldiers started to lay down their arms, refusing to fire on the crowd. Someone in the crowd shouted, quote, "The army is with us," end quote, and the crowd surged forward, climbing over the tanks and barricades and beginning to fraternize with the soldiers. Some soldiers joined the crowd at this point. Most fell back and returned to barracks. Almost none of them followed orders to fire on the crowd. The next day, on December 20th, Ceausescu returned from a state visit to Iran and began to take the situation a little more seriously. He bussed thousands of factory workers who belonged to the party's paramilitary militia from surrounding areas into Timișoara to put the demonstrations down. They were told that the demonstrators were all foreign interlopers and Hungarian malcontents. When they arrived in the city and were confronted by fellow Romanian factory workers, most of them dispersed and went home, leaving the demonstrators in effective control of the city. As news of the events in Timișoara spread around the country, similar demonstrations popped up in most of Romania's major cities, including the capital, Bucharest. Ceausescu seems to have been convinced, based on the origins of the protest in Timișoara, that the protests were largely fueled by discontent in the minority Hungarian community, and that the ethnic Romanian majority, especially the working class, remained loyal to him. But as I said before, the protests no longer had anything to do with Laslo Tokes, and the vast majority of demonstrators around the country were ethnic Romanians, many of them workers. Ceausescu's own propaganda appears to have gone to his head, and he was adamant to the end that he had the support of the people. All over, demonstrators were fighting back against the army. The army was taking casualties, and hundreds of civilians were being killed. On December 21st, Ceausescu decided he needed to rally his own supporters for a massive demonstration in support of the regime in Bucharest, where up to this time, the regime had mostly managed to prevent demonstrations from spiraling out of control. Around midday, Ceausescu appeared on the balcony of the party Central Committee headquarters, overlooking what was then Palace Square in Bucharest. Not to give any spoilers, but it's today known as Revolution Square. On the square below was a largely manufactured crowd of supporters carrying red banners with communist slogans and youthful, flattering portraits of the leader. After giving a few introductory remarks, Ceausescu was distracted by a disturbance in the square below. People could be heard shouting in panic, and the video feed of the event being aired live on Romanian state TV abruptly cut off. To this day, it's unclear exactly what the disturbance was. We know now that anti-regime counter-demonstrators were gathered around the periphery of the rally. Some have speculated that the panic was a response to security forces firing tear gas at these counter-demonstrators. Others maintain that there was an equipment malfunction among the state media outlets reporting on the speech and rally that caused some injuries in the crowd. Nobody knows exactly what caused it. What we do know is that the face Ceausescu made at this moment, captured live on TV, was one of confusion and panic. Whether true or not, it appeared at the time to be the exact moment he made the realization that he had lost control of events, and his response was fear. I will try to post a link to a video of the speech on the website because I just don't think my words here can do it justice. It was a particularly important turning point because this moment of truth was broadcast live on television by the regime's own tightly controlled media, and it spread the realization that the regime was in a state of collapse, forcing many people down off the fence to choose a side. They almost universally sided against Ceausescu and the regime. Ceausescu eventually finished his speech, promising an expansion of the welfare state and increased benefits for pensioners as an olive branch to those whose source of discontent was the economic situation. But he promised no political reforms, and it was too late anyway. After the disastrous rally at Central Committee headquarters, demonstrations against the regime sprung up all over Bucharest. Once again, Ceausescu ordered the army to put the demonstrations down by force, but officers on the ground were reluctant to order their troops to use live ammunition, aware as they were of how hopelessly outnumbered they were by protesters, and also aware of what had happened in Timișoara. So, throughout the afternoon, a sort of tense, eerie calm overcame most of the city, as huge crowds of thousands of demonstrators faced off against soldiers, neither wanting to initiate a slaughter. Then, around midnight, an army truck convoy attempted to move through a side street that was blocked by demonstrators. The demonstrators were calling for the trucks to back up and go back the way they had come. When the driver of the lead truck proved reluctant to do so, an unknown demonstrator tried to persuade him by throwing a brick through the truck's windshield. The brick struck the driver in the head, knocking him unconscious and causing the truck to lurch forward into the crowd, running over and killing several demonstrators. With that, the calm was broken. Demonstrators surged forward, overwhelming the convoy and forcing several soldiers to fire their weapons in self-defense. Reinforcements arrived to support the soldiers in the convoy, and the crowd was eventually driven off around 3 a.m. on December 22nd. When the shooting stopped, 49 demonstrators were dead, 463 were wounded, and nearly 700 had been arrested. Later that morning, the commander-in-chief of the army, General Vasily Milea, died. It remains hotly debated among historians of the revolution whether he committed suicide or was murdered on the orders of Ceausescu. The whole truth will probably never be known. He was already in disfavor with Ceausescu after he had initially refused orders from Ceausescu to order soldiers to shoot protesters in Timișoara. Multiple witnesses reported to a parliamentary inquiry the following year that just before his death that morning, Milea had relayed orders to multiple commanders not to shoot at demonstrators with live ammunition in Bucharest, though no documentary evidence of this order has ever been found. It was nonetheless at least a rumor at the time among the rank-and-file soldiers. What we know for sure is that sometime between 9:30 and 10:40 a.m. on December 22, 1989, Melia suffered a gunshot wound to the chest, narrowly missing his heart, and he either died instantly or shortly thereafter en route to the hospital. Whether he shot himself, as reported by the regime, or was murdered by the regime, as became a part of the legend of the revolution, is to this day unknown, and to the best of my knowledge, no conclusive evidence has been produced in either direction. However, he died. When the news of his death was reported on state TV later that morning, the soldiers made the same leap everyone else did. They assumed he had been murdered by the regime. Upon hearing this news, soldiers started to defect en masse, either laying their weapons down and going home, or in many cases joining the demonstrators and turning their guns on the Securitate, who for the moment were the only forces still loyal to Ceausescu. Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu spent the night at the Central Committee headquarters, as their security could not have been guaranteed amidst the chaos of the city had they tried to leave. Around 11 a.m., they gathered the entire Central Committee to deliberate on how to solve the crisis. For the first time, some members of the Central Committee dared to criticize Ceausescu. The meeting was interrupted around 11:30, as the crowd of thousands of demonstrators closed in on the Central Committee headquarters. Ceausescu, believing delusionally that he still had the support of an overwhelming majority of the people, decided to go outside and address the crowd. He appeared on the same balcony he had spoken from the day before, and barely got 2 sentences into his remarks before he was interrupted by boos from the crowd. He was swept inside by his security team as the crowd pushed through the thin security barricade and breached the doors below. With the crowd overrunning the lower floors, the Ceausescus had nowhere to go but up. Orders were sent to a nearby military base to send a helicopter. Around noon, the Ceausescus and their retinue boarded onto an overloaded helicopter that was barely able to take off from the roof of the Central Committee headquarters, just as the angry mob calling for their heads was about to overtake them. They fled in such a hurried panic that at first they did not know where to tell the pilot to take them. They eventually landed in a field near the city of Titu, flagged down a car and then another car, and ultimately found their way to a nearby army base, where they were taken in. Whether the soldiers took them in to protect them or hold them as prisoners, they weren't sure. Meanwhile, back in Bucharest, the crowd of demonstrators was in control of the Central Committee headquarters, and with the soldiers either joining them or standing down, the revolution was in control of the city and, indeed, the country. But they were a little bit like a dog that caught a car. The demonstrators up to this point hadn't really had any unified ideological message other than anger at the regime and a wish for change. So there wasn't really any organized group or individual that was immediately obvious for the forces of revolution to rally around. And so various ambitious politicians and dissident leaders took turns filtering onto the balcony in front of the crowd to try and declare themselves the leader. But the crowd was not obviously more responsive to one than another. This absurd game of musical chairs went on at the Central Committee headquarters for a few hours, with nobody emerging as a clear leader. As this was going on, 2 well-known dissidents, actor Ion Karamitru and poet Mircea Dinescu, arrived at the headquarters of the Romanian state TV station, escorted by a group of soldiers in a tank, and took control of the station and its broadcasting equipment. Around 1 o'clock, Karamitru was the first to appear on television after the flight of the Ceausescus, and he addressed the nation, saying, quote, "Brothers, thanks to God we are in the television studios. We managed to reach here on the back of tanks, with the army, and with students, and with the people whom you see, and with thousands and thousands of Romanians." End quote. These activists who had seized control of the TV station recognized the position of power and influence they now held, and also the grave responsibility that was now theirs to try and restore order to a country that was still in chaos. Indeed, the bloodiest period of the revolution took place after the flight of the Ceausescus, as various groups vied with each other for supremacy, and in the confused fog of war, demonstrators and soldiers continued to shoot at one another in towns and cities around the country, and as military units confusedly fired on each other. Further, a flurry of revenge killings was unleashed around the country as mobs identified officers of the Securitate and their informants, in many cases mistakenly, and lynched them in the streets. Order had to be restored, and the people in the TV station recognized they were in a unique position to do it. Their next move was to invite members of the communist establishment who were thought to be sympathetic to the revolution to join them, as they could, while endorsing the revolution and condemning Ceausescu, present a sense of some legitimacy and continuity of government. Among those invited was the man who would emerge as the leader of the revolution and future president of Romania, Ion Iliescu. Born in 1930 to a Bulgarian mother who abandoned him, Iliescu had been raised by his railroad worker father and his stepmother. He joined the communist youth movement in 1944 at 14 in the midst of World War II, and had been well situated to advance in the post-war party after they took power. In 1956, he was elected as the secretary of the Communist Youth League, and in 1965 was nominated to the Communist Party's Central Committee, where he remained until he was removed from it by Ceausescu in 1985. Ceausescu demoted and denounced him because he was thought to be sympathetic to reformers within the party, and in particular an admirer of Mikhail Gorbachev. Indeed, there's some evidence to suggest that he was Gorbachev's choice to take over Romania in the event of Ceausescu's removal. In 1989, he was perfectly situated to be a leading figure. He was affiliated with the ruling party establishment, but still thoroughly removed from association with Ceausescu. He was also, though still a communist, more than willing to join a coalition with other political parties and movements. He appeared on television that afternoon, flanked on either side by soldiers and radical revolutionaries, and vociferously denounced the Ceausescus, accusing them of committing crimes against humanity and defiling the party and the memory of all Romanians who had died in the struggle for socialism. It was a relatively moderate, pro-socialist message, revealing little in the way of any positive program, and was probably intended as an olive branch to other members of the communist establishment, urging them to denounce Ceausescu and join the revolution. It was probably especially targeted at members of the Securitate, who it was feared might yet successfully mount a counter-revolution. Following his speech, Iliescu was brought by military escort to the Central Committee headquarters, where he appeared on the balcony to address the crowd around 5:30 that evening. There, he announced that he was withdrawing from the Communist Party and joining a diverse coalition of other politicians and groups to form the National Salvation Front, or NSF, as a provisional government. It wasn't clear if this provisional government had any actual authority or legitimacy, but nobody else knew who was in charge or had the ambition to step up and oppose them, so gradually most people just accepted that the National Salvation Front was the legitimate provisional government. And frankly, it would have been hard to put together a broader coalition than that encompassed by the NSF. Eventually, just about everybody joined. For my American listeners, imagine if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez joined with J.D. Vance to form a movement intended to unite Yankees and Red Sox fans. Groups that would normally have nothing to do with one another put their differences aside and worked together toward a common goal of restoring order. It's really kind of beautiful. Members of the group included avowed communists, reform communists like Iliescu, religious leaders from every denomination, conservatives and liberal Democrats, and everyone in between. It really was a rainbow coalition. I'm not aware of a broader coalition of political movements anywhere else in history. This is probably one of the main reasons for their success. No matter who you were or what you believed, there was someone to speak for you in the National Salvation Front, and nobody really had any appetite to oppose them. Iliescu appeared on TV again a few hours later, around 11:30 p.m., to announce the National Salvation Front's formal program. It included, among other things, the abolition of the Communist Party's monopoly on power, free elections to be held no later than April 1990, a new constitution guaranteeing independent executive, legislative, and judicial branches, privatization of the economy, guaranteed rights and freedoms for all, including national and religious minorities, and integration into the community of European nations. Despite the popularity of this program and the lack of any meaningful opposition to it, the country continued to descend into chaos over the next few days. Things were slowly calming down, but sporadic outbreaks of violence, revenge killings, and above all looting continued as people sought to take advantage of the collapse of the old system before a new one could be established to replace it. Slowly, the National Salvation Front managed to bring most of the army commanders and security authorities into the fold, which gave them the bold assertion needed to maintain the plausibility of their government. Several parties within the National Salvation Front were convinced that the ongoing violence was the result of holdouts still loyal to Ceausescu and the old regime. With the benefit of hindsight, we now know that this view was largely erroneous, but those who lived through it often did not have the clarity we do today. They were desperate to restore order, and uncertain of the stability of their own regime, and so the decision was made that for the safety and security of the country, the Ceausescus had to be eliminated. In an indisputable violation of due process and fundamental fairness that even Ion Iliescu later called regrettable, the Ceausescus were brought to trial before a military tribunal and what can only be called a kangaroo court. I want to be clear, I'm not defending the Ceausescus or their regime, but as a lawyer, the process to which they were subjected quite frankly offends my sense of justice. On Christmas Day 1989, 2 helicopters were dispatched from Bucharest to the Târgoviște army garrison, where Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu were being held, carrying a judge, prosecutor, defense counsel, and an execution squad to carry out the sentence, the very presence of whom reveals that the outcome of the trial was a foregone conclusion. The Ceausescus were charged, among other things, with genocide, subversion of state power by taking armed action against the people, and attempting to embezzle state treasury funds by trying to flee abroad with government money. The trial lasted less than an hour, with the outcome never in doubt. At times, the supposedly impartial judge often acted more like a prosecutor, dressing down the defendants in an accusatory tone. Even the attorneys appointed as defense counsel did not go out of their way to vigorously defend their clients. The Ceausescus were defiant to the end. Nicolae Ceausescu refused to stand for the judge and denied the legitimacy of the court, saying, quote, "I recognize only the great National Assembly and the representatives of the working class. I will sign nothing, I will say nothing, I refuse to answer to those who have fomented this coup d'etat. I am not the accused. I am the President of the Republic. I am your Commander-in-Chief." End quote. The trial moved forward in spite of the defendant's objection to the jurisdiction of the court. It was a farce throughout. Questioning from the prosecution mostly took the form of shouted accusations, and there were few objections from the defense. Eventually, exasperated with the pointlessness of the exercise, Nicolae Ceausescu pointed to his watch and said, quote, "Let's get this over with," end quote. After the trial, the court deliberated for about 5 minutes and then handed down a guilty verdict, with a sentence of death to be carried out immediately. Nicolae remained defiant to the end, telling the court, quote, "I don't recognize the legitimacy of this court. Whoever staged this coup can shoot whoever they want. The traitors will answer for their treason. Romania will live and learn of your treachery. It is better to fight with glory than live as a slave." End quote. Witnesses said there were tears in Nicolae's eyes at this point, but Elena's eyes were dry and filled with rage as she screamed and swore at her would-be executioners. They were both blindfolded and dragged out to a courtyard to be shot. Finally, Elena relented her shouting and said, quote, "If you want to kill us together. We will always be together." End quote. As they were lined up against a wall outside, Elena said to her husband, quote, "Look, they are going to shoot us like dogs. I can't believe this. Is the death penalty still in force in Romania?" End quote. The firing squad then opened fire, showering the couple with more than 100 bullets. The executioners had orders not to shoot Nicolae in the head, as it was important that his body be identifiable. They had no such orders for Elena, who was shot in the face as well as the body. They both died relatively quickly. Such lawless brutality rarely ushers in an era of democracy and rule of law, but Romania in 1989 seems to be an exception. Romania thereafter adopted a new constitution, held free and fair elections, and to this day boasts a thriving, if still imperfect, democracy. The last vestiges of the communist era in Eastern Europe died with the Ceausescus. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, a very special thank you to my patrons who support the show with monthly donations on Patreon. If you appreciate what I do and want to support the show, you can become a patron at patreon.com/historyspherepodcast. If you can't afford to become a patron, I get it. Times are hard right now. You can also support the show by giving it a 5-star rating on your podcast platform of choice, subscribing, and by telling your friends about us. If you're listening on Spotify, you can leave a comment directly on the episode, and I encourage you to do that. Ask a question, correct a mistake, or just tell me what you thought of the episode. More engagement helps to promote the show in the algorithm and introduce it to new listeners, so all of your input is greatly appreciated. Links to the Patreon, the show's social media pages, and all my streaming platforms can be found on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. On that website, you will also find a list of my sources for this episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. Next time, on the History Sphere, I will return to the Soviet Union and begin a series of episodes on the simultaneous upheavals within the USSR as the Eastern Bloc collapsed in 1989 and immediately after. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.